Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library. So glad you could join me for today's reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Today we will be reading chapters 39 and 40. Just a brief recap on where we are in the story. The sailors, Captain Nemo, our three protagonists have all been taken to, under the captain's wishes, sailed the Nautilus to the South Pole. Their goal was to be the first people to discover the South Pole, of course, in the 1860s. That had not happened yet. And so what we are given in these last two chapters were that the Captain Nemo was basically manning the helm himself to pass through these large blockades of ice. Now they're going in the wintertime, which they say in there is the worst time to go, because it's not only is it going to be so cold, but of course there's so much more ice, and it's going to be very difficult. But Captain Nemo says he's going to do it, and his Nautilus can make the trip, and so he's determined to do this. And everyone else is just kind of watching along, hoping that he's right in what he does, but they also suspect that there is a bit of mania about him, that he can be somewhat foolhardy in his desire to reach these places. So the goal here is to use the Nautilus submarine to go under the icebergs, to go under the wall of ice, the Great Ice Barrier, as it's called, and somehow reach Antarctica and the South Pole. And though it takes several days and several attempts, and even sometimes when they have to use the Nautilus itself as a battering ram to smash through the ice, they end up making it. So the Captain Nemo was the first to step foot onto the Antarctic continent and plants a flag, with a black flag with a gold N for Nemo, in the land, and claims it for himself. So there we go. And that's how we ended it on Monday, our last reading. Today we will start with chapter 39, which is entitled Accident or Incident. At 6 o'clock in the morning of the next day, March 22nd, preparations for departure were begun. The last glimmer of twilight was melting into the night. The cold was sharp. The stars were shining with surprising intensity. Straight overhead I could make out the marvelous Southern Cross, that polar star of Antarctic regions. The thermometer marked 9 degrees above zero, and when the wind came up it was very biting. Ice was forming on the open water, and the sea started to congeal everywhere. Obviously, this southern basin was frozen over for 6 months of the year, during which time it was absolutely inaccessible. What did the whales do then? Undoubtedly, they went under the ice barrier in search of open water. As for seals and walruses, they were accustomed to the extremely cold climate, and they stayed in this frozen waste. Out of instinct, they make holes in the ice field and keep them always open. This is where they come to breathe, and when the birds migrate north to escape the cold, these marine mammals remain sole masters of the Antarctic continent. Meanwhile, the Nautilus's tanks had been filled, and it slowly sank beneath the surface. When it reached a depth of 1,000 feet, it stopped. Its propeller began churning the water, and it headed straight north at a speed of 15 knots. That afternoon it was already cruising beneath the immense shell of the Great Ice Barrier. The panels in the lounge had been closed in case the Nautilus should strike submerged ice. Therefore, I spent the day putting my notes in order. My mind was completely occupied with thoughts of the South Pole. We had reached that inaccessible point with no more fatigue or danger than if we had been traveling in a train. And now we were beginning the return journey. Would it bring new surprises? I had no doubts, for there seemed to be no end to the wonders of underwater life. Nevertheless, since fate had brought us on board this ship 5.5 months ago, we had covered 14,000 leagues, and on this trip, which was longer than the circumference of the earth, how many fascinating or terrifying incidents had held us spellbound. The hunting expedition in the forests of Crespo Island, running aground in Torres Strait, the coral graveyard, the pearl fisheries of Ceylon, the Arabian Tunnel, the volcano of Santorin Island, the treasure at Vigo Bay, Atlantis, the South Pole. During the night, all these memories passed by one after another in my dreams and did not allow my brain to rest for an instant. At 3 in the morning, I was awakened by a violent blow. I sat up in bed and tried to hear what was going on, but suddenly I was hurled out into the middle of the room. Obviously, the Nautilus had collided with something and then heeled over at a sharp angle. Feeling my way along the walls, I dragged myself along the gangways to the lounge, where the ceiling lights were still on. The furniture had been knocked over. Luckily, the showcases were well attached to the floor and had therefore remained upright. The pictures on the starboard side of the room were flat against the wall, while those on the port side were leaning out with their lower edges a foot away from the wall. The Nautilus was heeled over to starboard, and moreover, completely immobile. Inside, I could hear the sound of footsteps, and a confused murmur of voices. But Captain Nemo did not appear. Just as I was about to leave the lounge, Ned Land and Conseil entered. "What happened?" I asked them at once. "That's what we just came to ask monsieur," replied Conseil. "Confound it!" cried the Canadian. "I can tell you what happened. The Nautilus ran aground, and judging by the way it heeled over, I don't think we're going to get away as easily as we did at Torres Strait." "But are we at least on the surface?" "I don't know," replied Conseil. "It's easy to find out," I answered. I looked at the pressure gauge. To my great astonishment, it indicated a depth of 1,180 feet. "What's all this about?" I cried. "We'll have to ask Captain Nemo," said Conseil. "Where is he?" asked Ned Land. "Follow me," I said to my two companions. We left the lounge. There was no one in the library, no one either at the central companionway or the crew's quarters. I suppose that Captain Nemo was in the helmsman's compartment. The best thing to do was wait. All three of us returned to the lounge. I will pass over the Canadian's recriminations. I can't say his anger was unjustified, but in any case, I let him get rid of his ill humor without answering. We remained like this for 20 minutes, listening for the slightest noise inside the Nautilus, when Captain Nemo entered. He seemed not to see us. His face, usually so impassive, showed signs of uneasiness. He silently checked the compass and the pressure gauge, and then went over to a map of the world and put his finger on the Antarctic seas. I did not want to interrupt him. However, when he turned toward me several minutes later, I asked him, using a phrase he had employed in Torres Straits, "Merely an incident, Captain?" "No, monsieur," he replied. "This time it is an accident." "Is it serious?" "Perhaps." "Is there any immediate danger?" "No." "Has the Nautilus run aground?" "Yes." "How did it happen?" "By a trick of nature. Not through the incompetence of men. We did not make a single mistake in our maneuvers. Nevertheless, one cannot prevent laws of equilibrium from taking effect. One can resist the laws of men, but not those of nature. Captain Nemo had chosen an odd moment to start philosophizing, and, moreover, his answer told me nothing. Could you please tell me, Captain, what caused this accident? An enormous block of ice, as big as a mountain, has turned over, he replied. When icebergs become eaten away underneath by warm water or by repeated blows, their center of gravity rises. Then the whole mass of ice turns upside down. This is what has happened. One of these icebergs turned and struck the Nautilus as it was cruising underwater. The iceberg then slipped under its hull and lifted it with an irresistible force into shallower water, where it is now lying heeled over on its side. But can't you free the Nautilus merely by emptying its reservoirs and thereby returning to an upright position? That is what we're trying to do now, monsieur. You can hear the pumps working. Look at the pressure gauge. It shows the Nautilus is rising. But, unfortunately, the block of ice is rising with it. And until some obstacle stops its upward movement, our position will not change. And in fact, the Nautilus was still lying on its side. Undoubtedly, it would straighten up when the block of ice stopped turning. But who was to say at that moment we wouldn't collide against the underside of the barrier, and thus be horribly squashed between two surfaces of ice? I thought over all these consequences of our situation. Captain Nemo did not take his eyes off the pressure gauge. Since it was first struck by the iceberg, the Nautilus had risen about 150 feet, but it was still heeling over at the same angle. Suddenly, I could feel the hull make a slight movement. Evidently, the Nautilus was righting itself a bit. The objects hanging in the lounge began to go back to their normal positions, and the walls became more vertical. None of us said a word. With beating hearts, we watched the ship right itself. The floor became horizontal beneath our feet. 10 minutes went by. "We're upright at last," I cried. "Yes," said Captain Nemo, as he headed for the door of the lounge. "Do you think we'll get free?" "Certainly," he replied, "since the reservoirs are not yet empty." The captain left, and I soon saw that at his orders the upward course of the Nautilus had been stopped. We were, in fact, close to striking the underside of the ice barrier, and it was better to remain free in the water. "Well, we got out of that one," said Conseil. "Yes, we could have easily been squashed between two blocks of ice, or, at least, imprisoned, and then, without any way of renewing our air supply. Yes, we're well out of that one." "Presuming it's all over," murmured Ned Land. I don't want to start a useless argument with the Canadian, and I therefore did not reply. Moreover, just then, the panels opened and light poured in from outside. We were suspended in the water, but 30 feet away on each side of the Nautilus rose a shining wall of ice. Above and below there was the same wall. Above, because the underside of the ice barrier formed an immense ceiling. Below, because the overturned iceberg had slid so as to come to rest on the two side walls. The Nautilus was imprisoned in a veritable tunnel of ice about 60 feet across and filled with calm water. It was therefore easy to get out by going either forward or backward, and then to set out again several hundred yards deeper on a free passage under the ice barrier. Even though the lights in the lounge had been put out, It was brilliantly illuminated by the walls of ice acting as powerful reflectors for light on top of the submarine. I could not possibly describe the effect of its rays on these huge blocks cut into such strange shapes. Every one of their angles, ridges, and facets gave off a different hue. It was a dazzling mine of precious stones, and especially of sapphires and emeralds flashing their blue and green rays in all directions. Here and there one could see soft, milky opal nuances running among fiery diamond-like points of light shining with such brilliance that one could hardly look at them. The power of the Nautilus was multiplied 100 times, like that of a lamp passing through the lenses of a beacon. "How beautiful! How beautiful!" exclaimed Conseil. "Yes," I said, "it's a marvelous sight. Don't you think so, Ned?" "Yes, confound it," he retorted. "It's magnificent, even though it makes me furious to have to admit it. I've never seen anything like it. But this sight could cost us our necks, and to be frank, I feel as if we're looking at things God didn't intend for the eyes of man." Ned was right. It was too beautiful. Suddenly, a cry from Conseil made me turn around. "What is it?" I asked. "Close your eyes, monsieur. Do not look." And with this, he clapped his hands over his eyes. "What's wrong, my boy?" "I've been blinded." Involuntarily, I looked out the window, but my eyes could not stand the blazing light entering the room. I then realized what had happened. The Nautilus had gotten under way and was now traveling at high speed. All the quiet luster from the walls of ice had changed into flashing streaks. The fire from these myriads of diamonds had blended together. The Nautilus, propelled by its powerful engines, was traveling through a sheath of lightning. Then the panels in the lounge closed. We held our hands over our eyes and saw nothing but spots, as if we had been looking at the sun too long. It took our troubled eyes some time to calm down. Finally, we took away our hands. "Goodness me, I never would have believed such a thing was possible," said Conseil. "And as for me, I still don't believe it," retorted the Canadian. "When we get back on land," said Conseil, "after seeing such wonders of nature, what will we think of those miserable continents and their tiny things produced by the hand of man? No civilization is no longer worthy of us." But such words in the mouth of an impassive Belgian showed to what a point our enthusiasm had risen. But the Canadian made sure to throw cold water on our excitement. "Civilization," he said, shaking his head. "Don't worry, Conseil. You'll never see it again anyhow." It was then 5 o'clock in the morning. Suddenly I felt the Nautilus collide with something ahead. I realized its spur had just struck a block of ice. It was undoubtedly due to some error in judgment, for this underwater tunnel was full of ice and not easy to navigate. I thought that Captain Nemo would merely alter his course slightly, go around the obstacle, and continue on his way. I felt sure our forward progress could not be completely blocked. Nevertheless, contrary to my expectations, the Nautilus started to move backwards. "Are we going backward?" asked Conseil. "Yes," I answered. "The tunnel is probably blocked at this end." "Then what are we going to do?" "Well, it's simple," I said. "We'll retrace our steps and leave by the southern end, that's all." In saying this, I wanted to seem more sure of myself than I really was. Meanwhile, the Nautilus's backward speed had increased, and we were now traveling very fast. "It'll take longer this way," said Ned. Several hours, one way or the other. What difference does it make as long as we get out? Yes, repeated Ned Land, as long as we get out. After a while I left the lounge and went into the library. My companions remained seated, without saying a word. I stretched out on a couch, took up a book, and let my eyes scan the pages mechanically. A quarter of an hour later, Conseil came up and said, "Is that an interesting book Monsieur's reading?" "Very interesting," I replied. "Undoubtedly, Monsieur is reading Monsieur's book." "What, my own book?" And to be sure, I was holding my work on the great ocean depths. I hadn't even realized it. I closed the book and started walking about. Ned and Conseil got up to go to their room. "Stay here, my friends," I said, holding them back. "Let's stay together until we're out of this blind alley." "As Monsieur wishes." Several hours went by. Again and again I checked the instruments hanging on the wall of the lounge. The pressure gauge showed the Nautilus was staying at a depth of 1,000 feet. The compass indicated that it was still heading south, and the log showed that it was traveling at 20 knots, a speed which seemed excessive in such a narrow space, but Captain Nemo knew that he could not really go too fast, for in such a situation every minute was worth a century. At 8:25 a second collision took place. This time it was behind. I grew pale. My companions came over. I took Conseil's hand. We looked questioningly at one another, our looks betraying our thoughts better than any words. Just then the captain entered the lounge. I went over to him and asked, "Is our route also barred to the south?" "Yes, monsieur. As the iceberg turned over, it closed off every opening." "Then we are completely hemmed in?" "Yes." Chapter 40, entitled Lack of Air. Thus around, above, and below the Nautilus there was an impenetrable wall of ice. We were prisoners of the great ice barrier. The Canadian struck the table with his powerful fist. Conseil was silent. I looked at the captain. His face had once again taken on its usual impassivity. He had crossed his arms. He was thinking. The Nautilus no longer moved. The captain then started speaking. "Gentlemen," he said in a calm voice, "there are two ways of dying under such conditions as these." This strange person had the look of a mathematics professor explaining something to his pupils. "The first," he went on, "is to be crushed to death. The second is to die as asphyxiated. There's no question of dying of hunger, for the provisions on the Nautilus will last longer than we will. So let's think about our chances of being crushed or asphyxiated." "As for asphyxiation, Captain," I answered, "we have nothing to fear, for the reservoirs are full." "Right," said Captain Nemo. "But they only contain enough air for 2 days. We've now been under water for 36 hours, and already the air inside the Nautilus needs to be renewed. Within 48 hours, our reserves will be used up." "Well then, Captain, let's get out within 48 hours. "Or at least we'll try by cutting through the wall around us." "On which side?" I asked. "Soundings will tell us that. I'm going to let the Nautilus down on the lower surface, and my men will put on their diving suits and start to work on the ice, wherever it's thinnest." "Could the panels in the lounge be opened?" "I can see no objection. We're no longer moving." With this, Captain Nemo left. Soon I could tell by a whistling noise that the reservoirs were being filled with water. The Nautilus slowly sank and came to rest on the ice at a depth of 1,150 feet. My friends, I said, our situation is serious, but I'm counting on your courage and energy. Monsieur, replied the Canadian, at a time like this, I will forget all my complaints. I am ready to do anything for the general safety. Good, Ned, I said, stretching out my hand to him. And what's more, he continued, I am as handy with a pickaxe as I am with a harpoon. If I can help the captain in any way, I hope he'll let me know. He won't refuse your help. Come, Ned. I led him to the room where the men from the Nautilus were putting on their diving suits. I told the captain about Ned's proposal, and he accepted. The Canadian put on his diving suit, and soon he was ready to go with the others. Each of them carried their tanks filled with a large supply of pure air. As for the Ruhmkorff lamps, they were unnecessary in the midst of waters so brilliantly illuminated by the ship's light. As soon as Ned was dressed, I went back to the lounge where I found the panels open. I took up my post next to Conseil and examined the ice that surrounded and supported the Nautilus. Several moments later, we saw a dozen men from the crew step out onto the ice, and among them Ned Land, easily recognizable by his height. Captain Nemo was also among them. Before beginning to dig, he had to find out the best direction in which to work. Long soundings were therefore sunk into the side walls, but after 50 feet, they found nothing but more and more ice. There was no use attacking the surface overhead, for this was the ice barrier itself, more than 1,300 feet thick. Captain Nemo then had the ice underneath it sounded. He found that only 30 feet separated us from the water below. It was therefore a matter of cutting out a space equal in area to the water line of the Nautilus. About 230,000 cubic feet of ice had to be removed in order to make a hole big enough for us to pass down through. They set to work at once and carried on with indefatigable energy. Instead of digging around the Nautilus, which would have involved great difficulties, Captain Nemo had an immense trench drawn on the ice 25 feet off the starboard side of the submarine. Then his men started chipping away along its edges. Soon the picks were beginning to take effect, and large blocks of ice were loosened. An odd effect was produced by these blocks, which, since they were lighter than water, floated up to the ceiling of the tunnel. And this ceiling, therefore, got thicker by as much as was removed underneath. But this made little difference, as long as the wall beneath also got thinner by the same amount. After 2 hours of hard work, Ned Land came back exhausted. His companions and he were replaced by fresh workers, including Conseil and myself. The first mate acted as our foreman. The water seemed especially cold, but I soon got a warm handling the pickaxe. I could move freely, even though I was undergoing a pressure of 30 atmospheres. When I returned after 2 hours to get some nourishment and rest, I noticed a big difference between the air from our diving tanks and that inside the Nautilus, which was already full of carbon dioxide. The air in the submarine had not been renewed in 48 hours, and it now contained scarcely any life-giving substances. After working for 12 hours, we had only removed a 3-foot layer of ice from the trench, or, in other words, about 20,000 cubic feet. Assuming that we could continue working at this rate, we would still need 5 nights and 4 days to finish. 5 nights and 4 days, I said to my companions, when we have only 2 days' air supply in the reservoirs. Without taking into account, said Ned, that once we're out of this darned prison, we'll still be under the ice barrier without any way of renewing our air supply. This was indeed true. Who could possibly calculate the minimum time required for us to get out? Might we not be asphyxiated before the Nautilus could surface? Was it destined to perish in this tomb of ice along with all those on board? The situation seemed terrible. But everyone faced it squarely and decided to do their duty to the end. As I had predicted, a new slice 1 yard thick was removed from the pit during the night. But the next morning, when I put on my diving suit and went out into the water, whose temperatures was between 18 degrees and 20 degrees, I noticed that the side walls of the tunnel were getting closer together. The water farther from the pit, since it was not warmed by the men working, showed a tendency to freeze. Faced with this new danger, what would now happen to our chances of escaping? How would we prevent the water from turning to ice and therefore cracking open the Nautilus's hull as if it were made of glass? I did not mention this new danger to my 2 companions. What good would it have been to risk their becoming apathetic and giving up the rescue work? But when I came back on board, I mentioned this new danger to Captain Nemo. I know, he said, in that same calm voice he maintained no matter how terrible the situation. It's one more danger for us, but I don't see any way to stop it. Our only chance is to dig faster than the water freezes. We have to get there first, that's all. Get there first? But by then, I should have become accustomed to his ways of thinking. That day, I wielded the pickaxe for several hours with great determination. This work kept up my spirits. Moreover, this way one could leave the Nautilus and breathe the pure air taken from the reservoirs and stored in the tanks on our backs. It was the only way to escape the foul, thin air inside the submarine. By that afternoon, the pit had been dug yet a yard deeper. But when I came back on board, I was nearly asphyxiated by the carbon dioxide saturating the air inside the boat. Oh, if only there had been some chemical process by which we could have gotten rid of this harmful gas. For there was no lack of oxygen. The water around us contained a considerable quantity which could have been extracted by our powerful batteries, thus giving us all we needed. I had thought of this, but it was no use, since the carbon dioxide produced by our breathing had already invaded every part of the ship. In order to absorb it, we would have had to fill receptacles with potassium lye and shake them continuously. But we had none of this chemical on board, and there was nothing else which would serve the same purpose. That afternoon, Captain Nemo had to open some of the spigots on his reservoirs and let a bit of pure air into the Nautilus. If he had not done so, we would have never awakened from our sleep. On the next day, March 26th, I once again took up my miner's work, starting in on the 5th yard-thick layer. The ice on either side and overhead was becoming visibly thicker. It was obvious that it would come together before the Nautilus could get free. For a moment I fell into despair. My pickaxe almost dropped from my hands. What good was it to dig when I was going to die crushed by this water, turning to rock? A death worse than any dreamed of by savages. It seemed as if I were between the huge jaws of some monster, and they were closing slowly and irresistibly. Just then Captain Nemo, who was not only directing the work but also working himself, passed near me. I tapped him on the shoulder and pointed to the walls of our prison. The starboard wall alone had advanced at least 12 feet towards the Nautilus's hull. The captain understood and motioned for me to follow him. We went back on board. We took off our diving suits and went into the lounge. Monsieur Aronnax, he said, we're going to have to take some heroic measures if we don't want to be sealed up inside this ice as if it were a block of cement. Yes, I said, but what can we do? Ah, he said. If only my Nautilus were strong enough to withstand this pressure without being crushed. How would that help us? I asked, not understanding what he was driving at. Don't you see, he went on, that then the fact that the water was freezing would help us? Don't you realize that this solidification would break open the ice field around us as it does the hardest of rocks? Don't you understand how it would save us instead of destroying us? Yes, perhaps, Captain, but however strong the Nautilus may be, it could not withstand such a pressure as that, and it would merely be flattened out into an iron leaf. I know, monsieur, we must therefore not count on nature to help us, but on our own ingenuity. We have to stop this freezing. Not only are the side walls coming in closer, but there are only 10 feet left fore and aft of the Nautilus. The ice is moving in on us from all sides. How much longer will the air in the reservoirs permit us to breathe on board? I asked. The captain looked me straight in the face. The day after tomorrow, he said, the reservoirs will be empty. A cold sweat came over me. But why should his answer have surprised me? The Nautilus had gone beneath the surface of the open water around the South Pole on March 22nd, and now it was the 26th, rather. For 5 days we had been living off the air supply on board, and what was left of the good air had to be saved for the men working. As I write these lines, the impression of how I then felt is still so strong that an involuntary terror comes over my whole being, and I once again feel as if there were not enough air in my lungs. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo, silent and immobile as always, was lost in thought. Suddenly, an idea seemed to cross his mind, but he apparently rejected it. And then finally, some words escaped his lips. Boiling water, he murmured. Boiling water, I cried. Yes, monsieur. We're enclosed within a relatively small space. Wouldn't jets of boiling water, constantly pumped out from the Nautilus, raise the temperature around us and retard the freezing? It's our only chance, I said. Let's go then, Professor. The thermometer showed the outside water to be at 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Captain Nemo led me to the kitchen where a vast distilling machines were operating, furnishing drinking water by means of evaporation. They were filled, and all the heat the batteries could produce was thrown into the coils passing through the liquid. Within several minutes, the water was boiling. It was then led off toward the pumps and at the same time replaced with more water. The heat developed by the electric coil was such that the cold water from the sea had only to pass once through the mechanism in order to arrive boiling at the pumps. It began to be injected into the surrounding water, and 3 hours later the outside temperature had risen to 21 degrees. This was a gain of 2 degrees. Several hours after this, the thermometer registered 25 degrees. It's going to work, I said to the captain after following this operation closely. I think so, he replied. At least we won't be crushed to death. Now we only have to worry about being asphyxiated. During the night, the temperature of the surrounding water rose to 30 degrees. That was as high as it would go. But since seawater will only freeze at 28.4 degrees, I at least felt reassured against this danger. By the next day, March 27th, 20 feet of ice had been removed from the trench. Only 13 feet remained to be chipped out. But this would still take 48 hours of work. We could no longer renew the air inside the Nautilus during the day. During the day, it became worse and worse. A terrible weariness came over me. Toward 3 in the afternoon, this feeling had increased to the point of becoming unbearable. I yawned so much I felt my jaws would come apart. I began to pant as the fuel needed for breathing became scarcer and scarcer. I became completely lethargic. I stretched out, feeling weak and almost unconscious. My good Conseil, even though he had the same symptoms as I and suffered quite as much, did not leave my side. He would take my hand, encourage me, and I could hear him murmur, "If only I could stop breathing in order to leave more air for Monsieur." It brought tears to my eyes to hear him talk like this. The more intolerable life became inside the submarine, the more joyfully we would put on our diving suits and take our turns working. Our pickaxes resounded against the ice, our arms were exhausted, and our hands chafed. But what difference did it make? Life-giving air was reaching our lungs. We were breathing. We were breathing. Yet no one prolonged his underwater work beyond the time allowed. Once his job was over, each man would give a gasping companion the tank which would pour life into his body. Captain Nemo set the example and was the first to submit himself to this severe discipline. When the time came, he would give his apparatus to another man and calmly enter the foul atmosphere on board, without flinching or murmuring. That day the work was carried on with even more vigor. Only 6 feet remained to be removed. Only 6 feet separated us from open water, but the reservoirs were almost empty of air. The little that remained was to be saved for the men working. Not one atom for the Nautilus. When I went back on board, I was half suffocated. What a night! I couldn't possibly describe it. Such suffering can't be put into words. The next day, I found it difficult to breathe. Not only did I have a headache, but I felt as dizzy as if I were drunk. My companions had the same symptoms, but some members of the crew were close to death. That day, the 6th of our imprisonment, Captain Nemo felt that our work with the pickaxes was going too slowly, and he decided to try crushing the layer of ice separating us from open water. He had retained all his coolness and energy. His moral strength dominated his physical suffering. He could still think, plan, and act. At an order from him, the submarine was raised off the ice, on which it had been resting, and hauled over till it was directly above the huge trench we had dug out. Water was let into its reservoirs, and it sank down into the trench. Then all the crew came back on board, and the double door communicating with the outside was closed. At that moment, the Nautilus was resting on a layer of ice which was less than a yard thick, but had been pierced by soundings in hundreds of places. The spigots of the reservoirs were then opened wide, and 3,500 cubic feet of water rushed in, increasing the Nautilus's weight by 220,000 pounds. We waited and listened. Hope made us forget our sufferings. Our lives depended on this one last stroke of fortune. In spite of the buzzing inside my head, I soon heard something trembling beneath the Nautilus. The ship started to go down. The ice broke with a strange noise like that of paper tearing, and the Nautilus continued sinking. "We are going through," Conseil murmured in my ear. I couldn't answer, but merely grasped his hand. Suddenly carried down by its terrific excess weight, the Nautilus sank as if it were made of lead, or, that is to say, as if there were no more ice under it. Then all the available electric power was put behind the pumps, and the water began to be dispelled from the reservoirs. After several minutes, we stopped sinking. Soon, in fact, the pressure gauge showed that we were rising. The propeller turned at top speed, made the hull quiver to its very bolts, and started us on our northward course. But how long would it be before we reached the other side of the ice barrier and could surface in the open water? Another day? I would be dead before then. I was half stretched out on a sofa in the library and felt as if I were suffocating. My face was purple, my lips blue, and my mind incapable of functioning. I could no longer see or hear anything. All idea of time left me. I could not even contract my muscles. How many hours passed by like this, I cannot say. But I felt I could last no longer. I was near death. Suddenly, I regained consciousness. A few breaths of fresh air entered my lungs. Had we surfaced? Had we reached the other side of the ice barrier? No, it was my worthy companions, Ned and Conseil, sparing themselves to save me. Several molecules of air had remained in the bottom of one of the diving apparatuses. Instead of breathing it themselves, they had preserved it for me, and while they suffocated, they poured life into me drop by drop. I wanted to push the apparatus away, but they were holding my hands, and for a few moments I indulged in the pleasure of breathing. I looked at the clock. It was 11 in the morning. It must have been March 28th. The Nautilus was traveling at the terrifying speed of 40 knots. It writhed in the water. Where was Captain Nemo? Had he succumbed? Had his companions died with him? At that moment, the pressure gauge indicated that we were only 20 feet below the surface. A thin ice field separated us from the atmosphere. Could we break through it? Perhaps. In any case, the Nautilus was going to try. I could feel it take an oblique position, lowering its stern and raising its prow. Then, impelled forward by its unique engines, it attacked the ice field from underneath like a formidable battering ram. It broke the thin ice. It broke the thin ice a little bit at a time, repeatedly going back down and then striking again at full speed. Finally, it made a supreme effort and rushed up at the layer of ice, crushing it beneath its weight. The hatch was opened. One might say torn open, and pure air came flooding into the whole interior of the Nautilus. And that, my friends, is the conclusion of chapter 40. So that is our reading for today. Hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've been reading along with me as well. And join us again in 2 days on Friday at 4 p.m. as we read the next 2 chapters of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate everyone joining in on this, and we'll see you again in 2 days. Bye, everyone.